So yeah, a little bit about yourself. Dr. Phillip, you've just come to Australia from Ukraine.
Yeah, it's true.
He's a bit jet lagged, so...
Arrived back in town.
He came back just for this, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I had to come back sometime, so this is what
Yeah.
So just...
Hey bro, we'll come have a seat, bro. Yeah, how you going? Yeah. And so just a little bit about the education background, or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, hey, great to be here, guys. It's a big night in Townsville, I noticed. Look, the plane up from Brisbane was absolutely packed. Non-spent seat, I got stuck in a middle seat, actually. Normally go on a plane, normally gives a room, but not this one. Middle seat, and the guy next to me was, I don't know, he was bigger than he should have been. So I was sort of towards the end of the plane, and I didn't really get a seat, I got half a seat. So my neck's looking a bit funny, angle, that's probably why. But just to, I guess, give a little bit of background of, well, first of all, I guess we're going to be talking about apologetics as a word that has been used. We'll get to that in a moment, but I'll tell you a little bit about my interest in it. But look, in terms of educational background, I attended school in Sydney. Then I went to Macquarie University in Sydney, where I studied science teaching and BSc. Taught for a year at Clara High School. I guess its main claim to fame was it was the school that Ellen first I went to before I was there. But anyway, she was I am younger than her. And then afterwards, well, look, I wanted to do theology and ministry and stuff, but look, for some reason I applied for medicine. It wasn't because I wanted to do it. I was curious as to whether I'd get in. I didn't expect to. I did. So what did I do? I'd actually thought about it, and there was actually a university professor in the United States who was a theology lecturer. I said, well, what do I do here? I actually want to do theology, but I've been accepted into a medical degree. And he said, no, go and do medicine. I said, well, hang on a minute, I want to go and do ministry. He said, no, go and do medicine, then go and do ministry after that. You can do both. And he said, he cited 5 examples of people where he said, look, they've done both, and they've been able to actually do a lot of effective things as a result of it. So go and do both. Okay, I couldn't argue with him, so I did that. I ended up doing theology as well. I did the Master of Arts degree in religion that Andrews University offers, but I did it at the Adventist campus. After that, look, I guess I went and did further medical studies. I've got my fellowship in general practice. I've done some other things in nutritional and environmental medicine, which is a particular interest of mine. So a lot of the preventative medicine and wellness stuff, as opposed to just fixing disease. It's good to prevent it and to be well, and hopefully live longer and contribute longer as well. So that's one interest. So I do some work actually there's 2 different practices I'm involved with in the Gold Coast. But apart from that, I have various interests in, I guess you could say, investing in the business world. So I've been a company director of various companies. One of them was listed on the stock exchange. That was, I guess, about 10 years ago. It's a company that's gone through various permutations. I'm no longer involved with that one, but there are others as well that I've had association with. So then it comes to, I guess, the whole area of apologetics. What is it? Well, before I get into that and start, I guess I'm interested in knowing a bit about you guys. I'm going to spend some time this evening and some time tomorrow as well. So, thank you. What I want to deal with today and tomorrow, and it'll be hopefully a very interactive way, is the whole issue of faith. Why do we believe? Is belief credible? Is believing in God something which a reasonable person can do? What about topics of challenge to the faith? What about issues of science? What about issues of maybe psychology? What about suffering, evil? Are there good evidences for God? Are there good evidences to believe that the Bible itself is something that we can take seriously 2,000 years or more after it was actually written? Now, these are some of the big questions. I'm sure there's many others, but these type of questions broadly are in the area of what we call Christian apologetics. I know that's a term that's been bandied about. It's not really a word that I like, because apologetics seems to suggest we're apologising for something. We're not apologising. In fact, apologetics just simply means to give a reason for why you believe. And that's simply what I'd like to be involved with tonight. I also tomorrow, exploring issues of faith so that we can actually have a good reason why we believe. That has two components. One is to give a positive set of reasons why Jesus Christ makes sense and why the Bible makes sense and why God makes sense. But also to have a reply for when people say, yes, but what about this? What about that? So really the objections to faith. How do we respond to those? It's also good to be able to think about those issues and to have a response as well. Now this is something which is entirely biblical. I just want to share a passage with you in opening. That's found in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. You notice that there's a few, I think, pretty key things there. So the first thing it says, but in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. So look, it is important that we know who the Lord of our life is. And clearly that is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ gives us purpose, gives us meaning. And so we're talking about something here where Jesus Christ is centre. But notice there, always, so it's not sometimes, it's not maybe when we feel like it, it says always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Interesting that the word reason is used. So it's not talking about maybe just a subjective feeling, although that is good. It's good to have positive feelings. But it's talking about to give a reason for the hope that we have. It seems to suggest then that there are good reasons that we can give for the hope that we have. And how's it to be done? And I think this is an important thing. It's not just about who wins an argument. How often have you been in a situation where you might have won the argument, but you maybe lost your friend? The person who you've so-called beaten in the argument doesn't respect you. Other people may not. See, there's a way it says of doing it. It says, but do this with what? With gentleness and respect. So I think the manner we go about doing it is very important as well, because I think we're going to win a lot more friends by respecting people and being gentle, as opposed to getting in some sort of debates and arguments. Having said that, look, there probably is a place for vigorous discussion, a place for even debates formally. I've got to say, I've really enjoyed some of the debates. You may have seen some of the DVDs of debates, say, between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox on issues of science and religion. Richard Dawkins, I guess everyone's heard of, one of the leading atheists in the world today, very vocal, very, almost you could say, evangelistic in his atheism. And then John Lennox, who I've had the privilege of meeting, lovely guy. He's a professor of mathematics and the philosophy of science at Oxford University. And so these guys debated. And look, if you get a chance, have a look at some of those DVDs, because I think Lennox does an outstanding job, and I think he comes out, looking very good, after the various discussions and the debates that he has. So, interesting there. So look, this is a passage I think is well worthwhile keeping in mind. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. So then, I guess the question is this: how? Actually, before then, I'll just tell you a little bit of background. I've just come back yesterday from Europe. I spent 4 weeks in Ukraine. And you're probably wondering, what on earth am I doing in Ukraine? Actually, I go there each year. I have since 2009, except for 1 year, and that was when Russia invaded Crimea, and I was supposed to be in Crimea, so I didn't go. But a friend of mine and I were involved in running public programs. We call them evangelistic programs, where we share the good news of Jesus Christ, and people make a decision, and many people are baptised, and I think that's a wonderful thing. My component of it is I deal with many of the questions of faith. So, for example, my opening topic is, can an intelligent person believe in God? And then I deal with questions. The next one is, has science buried God? How did life begin on earth? How seriously can we take the Bible? What are the historical facts about Jesus Christ? The resurrection, fact or fraud? Are all religions the same? Suffering and evil, why? These are the type of issues that we deal with, and look, there's many others that I touch on as well. But these are the type of questions that many people seem to be asking. In fact, it's interesting that when we present the material, a lot of people who have only met Jesus Christ for the first time are very excited because they see that, look, there seems to be a very logical basis to all of this. It's interesting too, people who have been involved with the church for many years saying, well, look, this is great, we've never heard this stuff before. We are very encouraged because, look, we certainly believed, we had faith, but we didn't realise that the evidence was so strong supporting what we actually believe. So, look, that's actually pretty exciting to hear that as well. So, that's something which I enjoy doing, and God willing, there's an invitation to go back in October this year, as well as next March, April, so look, it may be increasing in frequency. But then, look, at this stage I'll open it up, and look, I guess maybe I've given away some of the topic areas which are of interest, but I'm interested in your questions. And I guess I'll open the question this way. What are some of the key reasons to believe, and when I say believe, I speak about Jesus Christ, I speak about God, I speak about the Christian scriptures. So what are the key reasons or arguments that we can have for belief? And at the same time, what are the major objections against belief? The reason I do that, look, I'm just wondering, look, is there a volunteer that we could have with maybe someone who is maybe has much better handwriting than mine, for example, who'd be willing to write down, maybe on a piece of two pads or whatever, as we brainstorm, as you guys share, what are the ideas, what are the reasons for belief, what are some of the objections against. Fantastic, we've got a volunteer, appreciate that. So look, I'll open up to you guys. Let's spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and we'll just list them. No particular order. And what I want to do is then address those issues in some way over the course of today and tomorrow. So what we do now will largely set the agenda for the time that we spend together. So, who'd like to get the ball rolling? And it can just specify if it's an argument for or against, or if you're not sure, I guess just yell it out and we'll make a decision whether it's for or against.
So the question is, why do we believe?
Yeah, reasons for belief or objections against belief. So what would be some of the evidence or some of the reasons why we would believe, or on the other hand, what are some of the objections to belief that, and these can be either your own questions or friends or other people have asked. So just because you say an objection, I'm not suddenly going to think that that's you're struggling with that. You may be, or it could be something that a friend of yours is struggling with.
I think something that I've found is I'll try to share my faith in people who've given it a go and they pray. And they give God a real chance in prayer or ask for a sign or something, and no sign gets given or that prayer doesn't seem to be answered. And so for those people that I've spoken with, that's a real kind of, well, if it is fact, like you're saying, why wasn't there an answer? And so, I think unanswered prayers in people's perspectives has been a reason for why I've seen people.
Okay, so a possible objection. Okay, unanswered prayer. All right. Okay, so thank you for getting the ball rolling.
I think for me, for reasons to believe is more the Bible predictions about the world power and how they were on point before Christ and during Christ's time and where we are today. That's very convincing for me.
Okay, so Bible prophecy, Bible predictions?
Yeah.
Okay,
Prophecies.
Good.
So adding on to that, you can look at the other different books and different religious Buddhism, Islam, Taoism, and Confucianism, and then wherever else, and none of them actually have predictions of prophecy that actually come true. There was listening to Faith of them talking about Nostradamus, and they always look at Nostradamus, this great prophet, and out of his, I don't know, what was it, 5,000 predictions that he had, I think it was like 250 that actually came to pass. And the Bible always tells you then if they don't have all the truth, then there's no light in them. Another thing is regarding that there's the radio station actually is really good because just within the last couple of weeks I've learned a lot from that there's more evidence scientifically for the Bible, for God, and for Christ existing than there is for evolution. And something that I did back in the UK in the 90s when I became an Adventist. Nicky Gumbel did an Alpha course, and it was talking about historical documents, and it talked about the Battle of Hastings, that they've got like 5 documents, and a class this is history of 1066, this happened with King Harold, go on and now. And then there's another one that's got 20 documents, and we class this as history. Another one that's got 100, and there's 200, and it keeps going, and says, here we've got 20,000 documents, and we still don't believe this is actual fact. You know, and people just choose what they want to believe. So there's so much evidence out there if you wanted to actually find it and to believe it. And another thing as well is that what Boris was talking about with prayer. I came in into the church to study Daniel and Revelation. But having the first prayer that was answered was going away for the weekend, and we had some plants out in the garden. And slugs were continually eating the plants, and we had no time because we started keeping this up. We had no time to get any slug pellets to put these down to stop the slugs. And we just prayed, Lord, look after these plants. And there wasn't, when we come back 3 days later, the plants were fine and there was no slugs whatsoever. And so, not getting an answer, I've been disappointed not having an answer to prayer, but there's also the positive effects of being answered to prayer.
Look, I've got 4 there that you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was, going for the last one, so answered prayer, historical documents, so basically historical documents of the New Testament that you're talking about, archaeology, and the first one was other prophets. You could say other religions. So maybe you could say the uniqueness of Christianity, for example. Yeah. Okay.
Because that's factual and agree with the promises.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Do we have?
I can keep talking if nobody else.
Yeah. What about? Like some people believe in God because of the mess the world's in, but a lot of people don't believe in God because of the mess the world is in. It's sort of depending which way you look at it.
Yeah. Okay.
So the mess we're in.
So the mess we're in. All right. I'm sure there's some sort of other term we could use there, but yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
What about each generation always seems going, well, the world's getting messed up, it's in a dodgy place, or looking around, or it's getting worse, and each time God is speaking to me, it's just getting worse.
Yeah.
And every generation's been saying that, and it's not here yet. So, is he ever really coming? Because, how much worse can it get?
There was a question on the Sabbath school that we were down in the Sunshine Coast, and I was saying it's going to get really bad. But a lady was doing a Sabbath school teacher and says it's got to get as bad as it was in Noah time, that everybody was completely thinking evil all the time at that stage. We're nowhere near that, I don't believe. There's evil thoughts and stuff, but everybody's against each other. And, I believe that time will come, but maybe we're halfway there, 3/4 way there yet, but it's still.
So yeah, look, I guess what you're saying is worsening world conditions.
Yeah.
Being an argument either for or against. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And the other one, I guess, almost alluding to that, you'd almost say the problem of suffering and evil. It tends to be tied in with that. And I think that's a very common objection which we would say. Look, if there's a loving God, how could there possibly be? How could He possibly allow people to suffer? And why does evil exist? If He's an all-powerful God. But, so that's one certainly I think that many people say. All right, good. Well, we're just starting to get warmed up. I'm sure there's many other ideas out there in terms of arguments either for or against belief that people have put forward that you guys have heard.
I think an argument for me has always been just the unbelievable influence the Bible has had on shaping culture, and not just the Western culture. So, you know, whether it's language or whether it's our sayings or morality or whatever that's shaped the way we live, I think that the Bible has played a huge part in that. And if it was just fiction from the outset, would fiction get that much traction for such a long time? I've always found that to be compelling for me.
The influence, sure.
I get my friends with the point.
Okay, yeah.
And also what's going on for me, from friends who grown up in church situations and everything. I think it's really in the same situation it would be whether I was believing or not. So that's very
Okay, very, I guess, personal, pragmatic question.
yeah.
Interesting. So what's the point, or what difference has it actually made?
Yeah, what has God done in my life is
Okay.
For me, like, maybe more current than in history is like, probably against, like, an objection is like, especially like you grow up in the church and you just get told answers and there's no real critical thought to it, or no one's ever really asked a question. And sometimes when people do ask the hard questions, it's just kind of fobbed off type thing, like stop doubting, and then like we go to uni and then we get taught how to think more critically, and our questions are taken more seriously at uni, or we're given tools to find our own answers at uni, which sometimes, that's why I say present, because I know there's a lot of great Christian thinkers in the world, especially in history, but for some reason today our culture is kind of like, Christianity is kind of seen as like a fairy tale. It's like a real black and white, just, if that makes sense. Whereas you just get what you're given, whereas you go to uni and it's like, you feel like there's a wealth of knowledge out there that we somehow, or even someone in the street might say, I already know about Christianity or the Bible, just from assumptions. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. How would we list it on a piece of paper?
Reasons for what we believe.
So it'd be, you'd almost put that in the reasons against, wouldn't you, category?
Yeah.
In that, you'd almost summarise that as ignorance or blind faith.
Yeah.
I got one from when I was in uni. A lot of people laugh at the thought of creation. And so, is there any science, I guess? Well, that's a reason not to believe, because evolution's a fact, depending who you talk to.
It's interesting, yeah.
No, that's what they tell you. It's they've got all the answers, it's fact.
Yeah, okay.
That's what they say.
We could spend 3 sessions just on that question. It's a good one. So that's an argument for or against.
Against, because they've got the answers already.
I think something that is a deterrent to a lot of people or doubt is the requirement of faith. You know what I mean? Because there is, in the spirit realm, just the reality of the unknown as far as outside of what we experience day to day and physical and tangible, as far as the miracles that we read about, and as far as, you know, this invisible God, and that requires a faith. And I think for a lot of people, they've just taken the mindset of, well, if I can't see it, I don't believe it, you know? And so the requirement of faith often is the very thing that people choose not to believe.
Yeah, a couple of points there. So one is a requirement of faith, but the other one I hear there is the idea that there's something beyond the physical world or the material universe. So it's, I guess the whole scientific method, and if we discuss this, is based on an assumption of naturalism, what we call, or philosophy called materialism, scientific materialism. So here we're talking about something which you can't quantify in the scientific process or the scientific lab. So it's something beyond the material physical.
I think one of the difficult questions that I have is, for example, the flood, the universal flood. I guess I ask the question is that could God have done something different than the flood? I'm not sure.
So you're thinking from the point of view of what he physically would do, or rather the moral issue of was there a question, should he have destroyed everyone and done something different? You're talking about in what he did, the moral question, or the mechanism in terms of he'd done it differently?
Yeah, I think the mechanism of it.
Okay. All right. Would you categorise that as either an argument for or against, or at this point simply, I guess, a question which doesn't fit into either of those categories?
I think it's more a question that it's not fitting to just a picture of a living God.
All right, let's just spend another 2-3 minutes just we're developing a good list which will set our agenda. Let's just come up with maybe 2 or 3 more.
Well, the population, how the population was created through, was God abdicating incest? Because that's one of the things that are, with Adam and Eve. And then you just got the family growing, and then is that okay? Did you then hear about anything else? That's not to say that there wasn't anybody else or whatever.
Yeah, okay, interesting one. Okay, so query incest in early scripture. Yeah. Okay.
I think a big reason for doubt, sorry I'm saying these so much, but a big reason for doubt is that people are not seeing the connection between the words Christians speak and the life they live.
Okay.
And so if there was true, we'd see a difference. And so I think that a lot of people out there, at least when I've been visiting and chatting with friends of mine, that's kind of a big thing they mention is like, they're the same, they just think they're better. You know what I mean? And so a disconnect between the faith that's proclaimed and the faith that's displayed.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think on a global stage, we kind of see that with the United States of America a little bit. On the one hand, supposedly, the big bastion of Christianity and all the rest, and I guess at the same time playing global cop and producing content. And you get that, you travel to Europe and you get a whole bunch of interesting views about America, and it's Christianity.
Which is a big one for my Muslim friends. That's
Yes,
the one
yes,
they keep
yeah.
bringing up, is that there's this disconnect between this just, righteous, faithful God and his followers, and then they often bring up America and the Christians that are just doing a whole bunch of stuff in God's name.
It's interesting. It's on the one hand America politically, on the other hand, interestingly, look, I'm not sure whether you guys get it, but in discussions with unbelievers, very often Christianity is acquainted with Roman Catholicism. I remember going to a seminar at Sydney University, which was on agnosticism and atheism, and every time Christianity was mentioned, it seemed that it was specific doctrines which just happened to be Roman Catholic that they were actually having a few cracks at. So it's interesting that there's a bit of I think an ignorance out there in terms of what really the Bible, what Jesus Christ actually said.
That's probably down to the media, because Catholics always appear in films all the time, because that's the token Christian in all films and TV. It's the Catholic that's the
But I guess it's still a challenge, or whatever the reality is. I guess that's our challenge, to put across a message, which is, I guess, a message that Jesus Christ wanted to put across, and that is always our challenge. And it's interesting that we do have to wade through sometimes layers of text and subtext, which is out there, because that's what the media and or others have portrayed Christianity to be. Okay, do we have maybe 1 or 2 more?
So discussions I have with my friends, I think it's something else, so with Christian friends, is the concept of second coming and everything after for that. It's just, I guess, too big and unbelievable sometimes. Yes, there's a history of the Bible and the other stuff before it's been, you've got the facts of evidence that the Bible is true, so therefore we should be knowing that last bit's true as well. But just the concept, I guess, is out of grasp, whereas, most other ideas, we can see evidence for it. But, yeah.
So,
So that's an again, sort of like it sort of weakens the faith of that idea.
so difficult thing extrapolating from the historical facts to perhaps the spiritual future realm.
Yeah, well, yeah, of what we've been told, the second coming and resurrection and beyond.
Okay, so what the Bible says about the future seems incredible or even implausible.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, good.
One area for me was the fossil record.
Yep.
Another irrefutable facts of science that we have this record. Insects and animals and dinosaurs. And that tells us the story of the past.
Yeah, so which...
As an argument against equally.
So the fossil record, okay, an argument against, okay.
And the other one was talks a bit about defense of God, so why is this and stuff.
Yeah.
More in the context of that God is restrictive. He's kind of like a shadowing figure on your life, which you're expected to abide by. So it's kind of like the restrictive freedom. It's restrictive.
So controlling. So controlling killjoy.
Pretty much, yeah. I do know a lot of people that kind of look at Christians and feel sorry for Christians.
That's why we're making a list, because these are all real issues we've got to address.
People don't talk about it. I think that's one of the biggest things that I find is that barrier of your camp and my camp, and there's no mutual respect. It's a very open conversation. And that's probably won't fit in either camp, but I'd be curious to see how can you sort of break down that barrier with someone and just have an open conversation with no that either side going through.
Good. No, I think it's a very, very well made point. Do we have a final one?
Can I speak a bit? I know people have a bit more personal, and I might be a bit ignorant with the whole religion thing, but and it's kind of, I think, maybe links with Maddie's and Boris, it's also interconnected, but I come from a place where I guess there's for me, religion, belief, I guess, to me, is about, believing in something, but then the fact that we've got this institution called the church, which I don't know if I don't know the Bible very well, guys, but how, I don't know if he had a church and what he taught, I'm not sure, but I'm just wondering if there's a stigma attached to churches, groups now, that I guess has been a personal reason why I haven't objected to believe, but I've objected to belong, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does make sense.
And I guess I still think there's reasons to believe, but does that mean that then I have to belong to a certain place where they have different doctrines? Like there's rules, it seems to me like rules. And a big one for me is you can't be gay. So, and that's a big one for me. Because I'm like, well, where do I belong? Because apparently I can't belong in most places, but I still believe. So for me, that's what I grapple with as not necessarily, as I said, an objectification to believe, but this might be a different thing. But yeah, I guess it's a reason why I haven't gotten into it.
Okay. I think it's a well-made point that the church itself has often been a public relations disaster for Jesus Christ and for the Christian faith.
Yeah, like I'm sure he didn't think it to be how it sometimes.
Yes, that's interesting. So, yeah, so the church itself can be an objection to belief at times. I think,
And
you know.
inconsistencies.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sorry, which one?
And inconsistencies within different churches.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Massive
You mean the
conflicting
differences?
doctrines and
Okay.
bickering between.
Too many denominations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, like that just brought to mind, you know, the Westboro dude from Westboro in America.
That's Baptist Church.
Yeah, and he gets up there and he's like, oh, Australia's on fire because God's punishing you, you know, all these things. Remember he was on when we had those fires? And like, that's how society views the church as being, even though that's just like one extreme person.
Yeah.
But he's
Of course,
got
that's going to make the news.
but he's the one that makes it in the news. Like, and like it's true, like we say, oh, Jesus loves and accepts. But then when it comes to us practicing, we can't handle it. And that's a challenge. And that's, I feel, the inconsistency in the church is objecting to people believing through its practice.
If I can say two more that popped in my head. One ties in with what Christos was just saying, and I kind of feel there's a intentional secularization when it comes to media content and things like that. And like, I just remember once we went and watched a documentary, Religulous, and it was, what's his name? Not Jon Stewart. Anyway, some comedian who went and did this. And I remember, because I belong to a religion and I believe in God and faith, and the church has been a blessing to me. And I remember watching this documentary about religion, and I'm like, these guys are a bunch of kooks. Because there's I think doesn't matter what faith, I think there's just people who have these really extreme views, whether they're spiritual or political or whatever. And if that's what's captured and displayed and influenced, I think that in itself can generate doubt and a fear to believe in the broad thing of Jesus and the broad belief of Christianity, because the idea and the image that you get of Christianity is the cougars picketing funerals of soldiers and that kind of stuff. And so I think the secularist influences that are out there that negatively seem to display things of faith. And the second thing is, I hear it so often, and it's the whole concept of tithes and offering. That in society, there's this thing that people believe, oh, they just want my money. You know what I mean? And I think that's a big thing that turns a lot of people off with the way that's being communicated and understood. And because I don't know, I found most people out there, a lot of the reasons aren't super deep and philosophical, but they're just really practical. Like, there's just this thing that they see and they're just like, that's not right. And so they've just been to a church, and for 2 hours they've pretty much been begging them for money, and they're like, this just doesn't feel right, that's not right. You know what I mean? And I think the concept of tithes and offerings is a big challenge for a lot of people, especially if it's connected with belief and faith. And
John Saffron.
I'm not sure.
But that then comes down to the understanding, doesn't it? And the understanding of what tithes and offerings are, and where you actually come from, and who actually is in charge of and how to create it.
I think all of these things come to understanding. These ideas are out there.
Well, good. Look, how many have we got now?
More than
Yeah.
How many for and against?
Okay, so again,
Against witness.
You're here for a reason.
19 again.
Yeah, okay.
7 for.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. It's interesting. In debating, they say it's often better, even if you've got maybe 10 arguments, it's often better to present your 2 or 3 strongest arguments and leave the rest out than to cover all 10, and by the time you've got 7, 8, 9 and 10 they might be a bit weaker, and by the time you get there, it might work in your case. So, in any case, I'm not too perturbed, 19 to 7. Having said that, I want to have a look at, I just want to add a few more on the foresight, because I think there's some critical ones that, even if you guys have put them on the agenda, I want to. And on the foresight, origin of the universe. Next one is design. Next one is the moral argument. And then we'll throw in one more, that is, well, we'd say broadly miracles, but specifically I want to speak about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure if it's right.
Sorry, about which one, the resurrection?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's good. Well, now that we've got a list of, 19 plus 7 plus 4, there's 30 things we need to deal with, yeah? And we've got, how much longer this afternoon, this evening? What time? I don't even know what time we've got from, which is dangerous because I keep on Actually, I'll tell you this. The first time I went to Russia, this was in 92, just after communism had fallen. And before then, the church was very much underground. It was not legal for churches to meet. And so when they did, on the rare occasions that they were able to meet in people's homes, they would preach and they would talk, and they wouldn't go for 1 hour. They'd go for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. So after communism fell, it's one of those things. The services never finished at 12 o'clock. If the preacher finished at 12 o'clock, everyone went home disappointed because the preacher had nothing to say. If the sermon went to 1 o'clock, well, okay, that was okay. The preacher had done their duty. If it went on to 2 o'clock, well, that was good because the preacher actually had something to say. Slightly different. It is, yeah. So that's the thing, 12 o'clock, we're looking at washes, and I guess maybe I've been influenced too much by the Russian and other cultures. Having said that, I know everyone needs to get a good night's sleep tonight. Actually, I don't know what time we're going to finish.
Around 8:30. 8:30 is good for everyone.
Okay, good. So we've got to cover 30 things.
I'm not 2.5 hours on the camera.
I forgot this is being recorded. I guess you can edit out the bits. What I want to start, and I think some of the more, I guess, emotive issues are very important. I'd like to deal with some of those tomorrow, some of the personal to personal stuff, because that's actually quite critical. But I want to deal with, while our minds maybe hopefully still very fresh, I want to touch on some of the scientific, because I know that the scientific stuff is on the one hand one of the major barriers to faith. On the other hand, I think it's one of the strongest arguments for, which actually might seem a bit of a contradiction, but I'll try to explain that. Because when it comes to, I was involved some years ago in a debate, well, strictly speaking it was a dialogue, but I guess it was close enough to a debate that we could probably still call it a debate, at the University of Newcastle. And this was a group from NASA, not the space agency, but the Newcastle Adventist Student Association. They put on an event, and there were 3 speakers for belief, and there were 3 who were from the Hunter Valley Skeptics Association. And this was in one of the big lecture theatres at the university. I think there were, I've forgotten how many people attended, a couple of hundred people there, and it was advertised across the university campus. And so some of you may have heard of some of the guys. You may have heard of Grenville Kent. He was one on the believing side, obviously. Sven Ostring, if you've heard of him, and myself. We were the 3 representatives on the believing side, and as I mentioned, the Hunter Valley Skeptics. The whole debate was on the question of God. And so we had, I think it was something like 5 to 7 minutes each to present our case, and then there was a general discussion between the panels, and then there was question and answer from the floor as well. So we took it on the question of God, for arguing for the existence of God. There were 3 major themes that we took. Our first speaker, which was Sven, spoke about the origin of the universe, which is actually a very good question. Well, in fact, there's even a more basic question, and that is, why is there something rather than nothing? This is a pretty profound philosophical question, but it still is a very good question. I guess we don't know. The point is there is what there is. We can't really answer the question of why from a natural paradigm. It's not really a question that has an answer. But then the question is, where did the universe come from? Now, the naturalistic or the materialistic explanation is that there was a Big Bang that happened. Why or how? Well, we don't know, it just happened. So essentially there was nothing that brought something into being, or as some of the physicists will argue, well, the universe caused itself. Which is very interesting that, that we can't really say that with too many other things and get away with it logically, but we can supposedly say that the universe was able to cause or to create itself. So we looked at the topic of where did the universe come from. The other alternative, so when you look at it, there's actually 4 logical alternatives. The first one is there was an eternal nothing, and out of that there came matter and mind. Mind being, I guess, the intelligence and the consciousness and all those other things that we associate with mind. So that's the first one. That's basically a theory of atheistic materialism. Then there's a second logical possibility, and that was that the material always existed, and out of that further material and mind came into being there. Now that was the popular scientific view, probably until about 50 to 100 years ago, probably mid-last century. It was replaced very much by Big Bang theory. And now there is no serious scientist that I'm aware of that would maintain that. It's been largely put very much to the side. The third alternative is that there was an intelligent mind, and the intelligent mind then produced matter and other mind. In other words, and that intelligent believers would equate that intelligent mind with God. And there's a fourth possibility, and that is the whole thing's an illusion. And there are some who believe that. Look, I think that one probably doesn't need a huge amount of consideration, because even to give one practical example, as we look around, the pain and suffering that we see, that we experience ourselves, all tends to be very real. And I think for the purposes of our discussion, we can probably put that one aside, the illusion, unless someone particularly wants to discuss it. So really, it comes down to a choice between the first and the third one in terms of most ideas which are out there at the moment. Now, here the question is this: what is more plausible? Here I'm not saying this is not proof, but I'm saying what is more plausible? That there was nothing out of which came the rest of everything. So the universe essentially caused itself or created itself. Although how you do that, that's an entirely different question. Or is it more plausible that there was an intelligent mind that brought everything else into being? And as I say, it's not a proof, but it's just simply an argument looking at what are the mechanisms and the more probable things. I throw that out. Any comments on that particular, I guess, flowchart or pathway, and what would your response be?
I think the question today is, like, if there's intelligent mind, then how did the intelligent mind come about? That's the biggest question all the time.
Good. I'm glad you asked that, because I was expecting someone probably would, because that's a question, and that invariably comes. Well, look, if it's so incredibly implausible that the universe could have created itself, and I think by any measure it is implausible, then look, you might say intelligent mind sounds great, but where did the intelligent mind comes from? Is that consistent? Now, that's where it gets interesting as you examine that further. John Lennox actually makes a very good comment on that very question, because he says God, by definition, did not come into being, is not created. There is no best-selling book that talks about the created God. God, by definition, is uncreated, is an eternal being, always was, is not part of the whole cause-effect situation, but rather is the first cause, or the prime mover, or the uncaused cause. These are some of the terms used in philosophy. So the idea is that we understand the principle of cause and effect. So every time there is an effect, we look for a cause. So if the universe came into being, we expect that is an effect, and we go looking for the cause. Now the question of God is, if God did not come into being and was not an effect, then we don't need to go looking for the cause of God. It is philosophically coherent and also defensible to speak about God as being the first cause, the prime mover, the uncaused cause. There's various terms which are used. It is entirely logical and consistent that God simply was and was from eternity. I'm not saying we can explain it, but there is no logical contradiction there. And I would argue it makes more sense for there to be such a God than for nothing to produce what we have in front of us. Yeah.
So is it a step of faith either way you want to go?
Well, if we take it more broadly, almost everything we do in life is a step of faith.
Yeah. But I mean, if you want to believe there was a God from the beginning, or from nothing, something came from nothing.
Oh, okay, yeah. The point is that almost any decision we make is based on the evidence and the way that our senses interpret that, and also our reason, our minds interpret that. So from the broadest perspective, we're acting on faith continuously in almost any decision that we make in life. So certainly when it comes to a choice of origins, then whatever position you take is faith. As I'll argue a little bit later, we can examine evolution, and evolution, the argument is it certainly takes a lot of faith, and I suggest even more faith to believe in evolution, but we will come to that. But it's a good point you make. So does it take faith to believe that there is an uncaused God? Well, yes, it does. Just as I think it probably takes more faith to believe that out of nothing the universe originated. The difficulty is, though, if you say that God does not exist, then you pretty much don't have any other alternative. Unless you go the illusion pathway, you pretty much have the only other possibility is that you've got nothing, and then out of that develop a universe. And I'm not sure how you can really argue that is scientific, because it's certainly not observable and it's certainly not repeatable.
What about the idea of intelligent art? So that sort of design and created it sort of like God, that isn't God, so it has sort of created that.
Yeah, no.
And has continued being a part of, or
Oh, yeah. So I think
And that's sort of the part B of don't believe in God, but do believe in intelligent design.
What you say actually is a very important logical step, and thank you for raising it. Because there's one thing to say that there are arguments for an intelligent being, but who is it?
Yeah.
Is it one of the gods that one of the major world religions has? Is it the Christian God? Is it one of the Hindu gods? Is it some god we don't even know about? Is it like a deistic God that set the universe into motion, like clockwork, and he's out there distant, and we have no knowledge of this God apart from that? And this is where, I guess, where I will go with this is, obviously I want to talk about a God who is a Christian God, the God of Scripture, and recognising a lot of people actually have baggage with the term God, because many people have been hurt in the name of God, in the name of religion. Many people think of God as being harsh, judgmental, vindictive, out to get them, punish them forever in hell. All sorts of ideas are out there. Whereas, no, look, I certainly take what the Bible says, and that is that Jesus Christ reveals God, and in fact Jesus Christ is God, and what's more, God is a loving God who actually wants the best for us, who actually, a great sacrifice to himself, it was able to solve and is continuing to solve the whole problem of sin and suffering and evil, and has a plan that in the future will restore everything to eternal perfection. So yeah, look, it's a good question, and I think it needs to be asked, and I hope that puts some perspective on I guess what I'm saying there. Any other thoughts on that origin of the universe?
Going back to when you talked about something created from nothing, I know my wife watched a YouTube video with Richard Dawkins and against, I think it's going to debate there for about 2 hours. and he was talking about that there was this professor or scientist that's going to be creating this thing from nothing. But then the cardinal said, well, that actual nothing is something. It's not actually nothing. It is something that exists already, and then he can create something.
Yes.
And so he's debunking the fact that nothing can't be created by man without something there in the first place. And I think there's arguments like that all about, with debates between Muslims, Christians, and atheists and stuff like that. And it's good just to pick up some of those important points that they make. There's good arguments that they fought against, which some believers find difficult to answer. That's down to them, and I wouldn't be able to answer that question either. But there's a lot of evidence out there for a God.
Yeah, and this is weird. That was just, I guess, the first speaker. I was the second speaker, and I spoke about design. I think design's a fascinating thing. Now, look, from a Christian paradigm, design, now there are some flaws in it because of the breakdown of natural order from the entrance of sin, but nevertheless, design is something which is incredible as you look at it. First of all, why is there order in nature in any case? And what type of examples do we see? Now, this is where, look, probably now, it's going to be towards 20 years ago, there's a guy by the name of Michael Behe, you may have heard of him. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. He's a biochemist. He caused a whole bunch of controversy and whatnot. But his basic argument was that there are systems within biology that are what he called irreducibly complex. So, for example, a mousetrap. So you take a mousetrap, it's got a wooden platform, it's got a spring, it's got a device you put the cheese on, it's got the mechanism that flips over and I guess captures the prey. But there's about five or six parts to a mousetrap. Take any one of them away, it doesn't work, does it? So it's useless. You've got to have all of the components there at the one place at the one time, set up correctly, otherwise there's no point. And so his challenge was, he said, look, Darwin himself said that if it can be shown that any of the organisms that came into being couldn't have evolved by slow stepwise changes, then his theory would be, I've forgotten the exact words, but it would be an incredible challenge to his theory. Michael Behe took up that challenge and said, look, here's some examples. He talked about the eye and how incredibly complex it is. One of the ones I think is quite interesting is blood clotting, where there's got to be 16 different clotting factors or proteins at any one point in time. Otherwise, you either bleed to death or you clot to death. So bleed to death, I mean people who have haemophilia. They've got one of those factors deficient, they cut themselves, they bleed to death. If you clot too much, you have heart attacks, you have strokes, okay, you die as well. Something as simple as a blood clotting, if you get it wrong, if one of those 16 factors is not there or it's wrong, the wrong concentration, you can have a major problem. So he's saying, well, look, that's an irreducibly complex system, actually much more complicated than a mousetrap. The point is, how was it able to develop? Because unless you have all 16 present suddenly at the one time, then you actually don't have, you've wasted the energy in having 15 of them because they have no particular purpose, they don't help the organism. And he used examples in immunity. I don't know, as a medical student, immunity was one of those nightmares. You had to look at all these different flow charts and all the rest. I'm not saying too many medical students actually master it, even when you graduate. It's still a struggle, but this stuff is enormously complex in the way that it relates itself. But perhaps the biggest one is DNA. So you look at DNA, 3 billion components, human DNA that is. Now, a typical motor car has 30,000 parts. Okay? Got no issue as designed. DNA, human DNA has 3 billion components. There's a guy by the name of Anthony Flew. Anyone heard of Anthony Flew? Okay. He was an academic. He was a philosopher. Probably one of the leading atheistic philosophers in the world in the second half of the 20th century. He was an active publisher. He would debate against believers, against Christians in university campuses around the world. He was a very, I wouldn't say militant, but certainly very vocal atheist. In 2004, he shocked the world by announcing he changed his mind, he now believed in God.
Oh, well.
And you know, this obviously shocked the community, the academic community. And so of course he was asked why. And he said, look, as he has been debating against believers, he was more and more impressed by the quality of the arguments that had developed during the 90s and the early 2000s. And particularly he said the design argument. He said the design argument was, he said in the end it was just totally convincing. And the particular aspect was DNA. He just looked at DNA, he investigated, he said there is absolutely no way that this could have come into being by itself. And it was DNA, interestingly, the natural world without any underlying bias or, how should I say, theological instruction or indoctrination or whatever term you want to use or teaching. He was a critic of belief, but because of the evidence of design, he changed his mind, which is very interesting. He's not the only one. It's, there's been various documented examples of such people who have done that, who have come to believe because of design. So design's a very interesting one. There's much more that can be said about design, but look, any comments or questions about design?
I think that's the point. It's the alternative to design. It doesn't really make sense. Like you've got that 4 possible explanations, and then you can easily, and then you got the design and evolution theory.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. I'll take several minutes to just digress on what.
I just like why you did that.
Sorry?
No, okay, I will.
Oh, just about it. Because, look, I think it leads on. Look, something I want to cover at some stage, but look, getting onto the whole issue of, because, look, it touches on evolution. And, look, I know evolution's been mentioned on the list. The pervasive theory in universities, of course, is macroevolution. And I've got to distinguish here between macro, which is large scale, and micro, which is small scale. Now, the point is that many believers will say, well, don't believe in evolution, at which stage the academics in the university look at them and think, well, you ignorant people. And why is that? It's because of, and this is a critical point, we've got to get our terminology, well, at least the understanding of right of what we're saying. And that is, macroevolution deals with the big picture stuff. It talks about the origin of life. It talks about how complexity happens, how things move from the very simple to the very complicated over very long time periods where there is increasing information, increasing complexity. So that's macroevolution. It's the time scale that they talk about millions and indeed billions of years. On the other hand, we have microevolution, which is small scale evolution. And that's where we talk about simply the science of genetics and change within species. So, for example, you remember in high school science you did, Mendel's P's, where you did, eye colour, and you did dominant recessive hereditary and traits like that. You also learnt about, Galapagos, the finches that Darwin saw, in Galapagos and different stuff like that. You looked at, basically you looked at inheritance. We looked at change within species. So when there is a rearrangement of the existing genetic information, the expression in the offspring can be different. And over time, species can diverge. So for example, you can have genetic information, and we know through selective breeding that we can then end up with one strain this way, another strain that way, which may end up looking entirely different, and indeed may not even be able to interbreed with each other over time. So the point is, microevolution is small scale, and it's not really evolution in the sense of new information being presented. It is simply rearrangement of the existing material together with occasional mutation, which may simply change the material, but it still acts on the existing material. Now, the reason I make that distinction is because many people will just lump evolution and say, well, look, the evolution, we don't believe in evolution. And so then someone who's an evolutionist will clearly see that microevolution is an established science and come back and say, well, what do you mean? You must be ignorant. Clearly evolution is a fact. This is where it gets interesting when you look at textbooks of biology and look at, evidences for evolution. What you'll find almost invariably and inevitably that you will have the evidences of a microevolution being those which are in the textbooks. The evidences for macroevolution are very scant indeed. But this is where what I think is sometimes, how should I say it, maybe not intellectually as honest as it could be. The textbooks argue from microevolution to macroevolution. So what they're basically saying is if we can demonstrate change within species and that there is change full stop, well then we've essentially proven evolution including macroevolution. I think that's the problem. But that's invariably what happens. So I just wanted to say that by way of background, because I think any discussion of science and religion and evolution needs to have that as a background to the discussion, because otherwise terminologies can be rather muddy. Yes?
So is microevolution like an example, like a wild dog being domesticated and 2 generations down the litter, they have completely different... have you seen a wild dog be domesticated into the litter? They have different features altogether.
So what you're doing is, basically you're working with the existing DNA.
So it's just the terminology's evolution, but it's just genetic.
Yeah, so within evolutionary textbooks they would have that as, so basically selective, natural selection is considered to be an argument for evolution, but all it is simply working out how genes are expressed through various generations. So the critical point is there's no new information. All you're doing is you're selecting out information. In fact, what you're really doing once you do selective breeding is you're actually losing information compared to the original, which would have a greater spread of genetic information. You're actually selecting some of that out, and in turn you're actually losing information. Yeah, so that would be an example of microevolution.
Looks like the first look at the macro.
Yeah, macro, yeah.
Is almost nothing, something from nothing.
Correct,
Evolution, whereas
yeah.
micro is, there was something there to start off with, that this information was there, it's just coming out in a different way.
And that is, and you've just touched on what I think is the next critical point. So thank you. Fantastic. Into it. Because that's the big question, and this is the next big question for macroevolution. Where did the genetic material come from? Because in microevolution we're working with existing material to reformat it and to change it, but we're not creating new information. And this is the problem. Okay, so we look at a typical biology textbook, and so it'll go along these lines. The origin of life. So it will say that there was, look, after the universe came into being spontaneously in the solar system, there was an Earth that was covered with an ocean. And there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and there were these basic building blocks which were not life, but things like ammonia, or carbon dioxide, or various other, I guess, inorganic compounds, methane gas, for example. And so then there was lightning, which came down, and it would strike the ocean, and out of that there were various compounds which were formed. And importantly, the argument is that there were amino acids which were formed. And then these amino acids, they form together in long chains. A typical protein chain might be about 400 units in length. And these bonded together, and so you had the amino acids, and then you had enough of these amino acids that then they were able to generate the processes of a living cell, and somehow there was a cell formed, and that cell was able to survive and then reproduce, and so that was the origin of the cell. And so then from one simple cell, then there became more complicated cells through mutations over time, where we've got multicellular organisms and ultimately multi-organ system beings, for example, human beings ultimately. So look, you're going to have a variation of that theme in pretty much any textbook of biology. Now, some will argue, typically it's been amino acids that were formed. Others will argue that maybe it was RNA that somehow went one way and then another. But look, it's still a variation on the one thing. Now, how plausible is it that this could happen? Well, I guess if you don't believe in God, there's really no other game in town. You've got to make it work. I remember speaking with a guy who did his PhD in this area. He did the PhD in the 1960s, so look, I guess he's not that young anymore, but he He was saying that he spent most of his time cleaning up the glassware. Because what did they do? They were able to do some experiments in the 50s, 60s, and you'll read about this because this is, this is one of the big evidences for macroevolution. They did the Miller-Urey experiments. Anyone heard of the Miller-Urey experiments? Okay. They basically simulated, so in a flask, they'd have, what they thought were the conditions of a primordial soup or, the ocean in the very beginning. They would shoot, electrodes, sort of zap them with simulated lightning strikes. And then they would collect the contents down the bottom and analyse them. And they produced a whole bunch of stuff, but they did produce some amino acids. So the thought was, well, if we can do that in the laboratory, then clearly this is something which happened, and we've got the solution, or at least partial solution, of how life formed on Earth. Now, this PhD guy in the 60s was saying, well, they spent more time cleaning their glassware from the tar and the soot, the byproducts, than they did in trying to actually analyse what was actually came out. Maybe that was an exaggeration, but what he said was it made a big mess. And this is a problem. That in the 50s and 60s there was a great deal of optimism about this. But then by the 70s and 80s it had turned to not quite so much optimism because they actually couldn't actually make it work. Several reasons for this. First of all, any oxygen doesn't work. That's why all the textbooks say there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. Well, why? Because if there was, then it couldn't have even got to square one. Then you have the problem of tar. The problem with tar is, look, tar just, life cannot develop when tar is there because it just actually binds up all amino acids and they're not going to form protein chains. In any case, there still were some individual amino acids that were formed. Next problem is you've got the fact that most reactions will tend towards disorder. You've just got to look at a teenager's bedroom, I guess, to see that, the second law of thermodynamics, that things will tend to more disorder unless there is active work that is maintaining that order. And this is a problem, that when you've got, even if you were to form amino acid chains or protein chains in water, the reactions, the bonds tend to disperse in water as opposed to attract. So as quickly as you're trying to add these protein chains together, amino acid chains together, they're going to disperse and fall apart. So how are you going to end up with those 400 and keep them there is a problem. Next one is a problem called chirality. Anyone know what chirality is? Okay, you know how you've got left hand and right hand? Now, you can superimpose them one on top of the other, and they're, for all intents, identical. The same with chemicals. Now, you can have left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Now, when you have lightning strikes and you produce them, you can have randomly an equal mixture of left and right-handed. But it is only the left-handed ones that will work in biologically active organisms. So you have those 400 amino acids for protein chain. If even one of those is right-handed, the whole thing doesn't work. So that's your next problem. Then you've got the problem of probability. And I'll simplify by saying this. Let's say, and for those who want the mathematical stuff, I'm happy to go through it afterwards, but let's say that we gave macroevolution every possible advantage. Let's say that we have every known subatomic particle in the universe reacting, not just a few amino acids in an ocean, but let's say we have every subatomic particle in the universe that is reacting. And let's say they're reacting at such a speed that it's 10 to the 20 times a second, which is actually every one of them will react more times each second than there are grains of sand in all the beaches of the world and all the deserts of the world. That's every one of those subatomic particles is reacting that many times in a second. It's giving every huge advantage. And let's give 30 billion years twice of what is considered to be evolutionary time. So, you've got every subatomic particle, you've got all of evolutionary time and double that as well. And you've got an extraordinarily crazy number of reactions a second. Now, the difficulty is this, that you still only have, for the mathematical mind, that it's 10 with 122 zeros afterwards is a number of possible reactions. Now, the probability of forming a single protein chain is 1 chance in 10 with 450 zeros afterwards. I won't spend too much on that, except simply to say, by an extraordinary magnitude of numbers, there has not been enough time in evolutionary history to, by chance, even to have formed one protein chain. even one. Here's your next problem. Macroevolution says that you have to have not only just one protein chain. We know that the simplest replicating cell has hundreds of different proteins. You have to have at the same pinpoint in space-time. So in all of evolutionary history, in all of that 30 billion years that we're giving, we need to have, in that one point in time and in that one point in the universe, not only one protein chain, we've got to have hundreds there. But then what's the use of hundreds of protein chains if you're in an ocean and with currents and they're just going to disperse? Next thing, you've got a cell membrane. You've got to actually have a wrapping that goes around it. And you look at the complexity through an electron microscope of a cell membrane, where on earth did that come from at the same time? Then you've got to have all the different other structures within the cell. Even a simple cell is very complicated. And here we've got the clincher, and that is, you still don't have DNA. You can do all of that, but you can't have a cell that can reproduce and divide. At the same time, you must have DNA, which is produced from an entirely different substance to the amino acids, which is even more complicated, has to appear there at the same point in time. And this is difficult. The origin of the first cell on Earth is a major problem for macroevolution. And you just, the textbooks can come up with some beautiful prose and poetry of describing what probably happened, but there is no mechanism in the textbooks, and what's more, there is no plausible science behind how it could have happened. Even though we have incredibly complicated intelligence and mind, we still can't understand how it could possibly have happened by chance. We have no mechanism. This is a point that Michael Behe made in his book Darwin's Black Box. He said that when it comes to mechanism of how irreducible complexity could have happened, the peer-reviewed literature is silent. There are many interesting articles about comparing different gene frequencies in different populations, etc., but there is no mechanism how this could have happened. It's interesting too, John Lennox makes exactly the same argument. He's saying, it's one thing to talk about, how something, give a description of something could have happened, but it's an entirely different thing to actually have the hard science behind even working out a mechanism. It actually gets one point even more difficult. And that is, I heard a guy by the name of Paul Nelson from the Discovery Institute. He's a guy who works in the United States. I heard him at a conference. He's talking about some of the recent advances in biology. And he's talking about how what they've discovered now, that even when you consider the various plant and animal groups, there is no way, looking at the genetics of it all and the DNA, that there's a single cell that life could have risen from. What's very clear, it is many dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of different cell lines that the different life has originated from. So this problem of a single cell becomes magnified because a single cell could not even have produced the biodiversity that we have, even if it could possibly have developed. Sorry, I've actually gone into, I guess, mini speech mode there, but I don't know. I guess I'll try to explain.
The question is that if the professors and the doctors know all this stuff, then why do they still believe it if there's no evidence to prove it? Because before I became a Christian, I didn't believe in anything. I just died and that was it.
Yeah.
And then, I became a Christian after evidence proved to me. And it's always stuff has to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, then are these guys actually stupid, but they're just very intellectual or what? Because it just doesn't make sense to me.
I'll put it this way.
Conclusion.
If you have a position that God does not exist, what other game in town is there? Where do you go?
That's right. But they've got to base their ideas on the way that they've been educated. It's got to form some understanding and some logic to the way that they understand things for them to come to the conclusions that they come to.
It's interesting that within biology itself at the moment, there's a lot of critique of macroevolution. A lot of the academics who aren't necessarily believers are critiquing where it's at. In fact, even in the 1960s, there was a conference between mathematicians and biologists. Now, the typical, having gone to mutations, etc., but basically the idea of neo-Darwinism, which is, I guess, the contemporary view of how life develops, is that mutations are the things, by gradual accumulation of mutations, then you increase complexity of information. Now, look, that has a lot of challenges simply because mutations are almost always either do essentially nothing or they're harmful. There's actual fact, interestingly, Richard Dawkins was on this YouTube clip where Dawkins was actually asked one time in an interview, can you give a single example of a mutation that has added information? And after about 20 seconds of where he didn't say anything, he asked for the cameras to be turned off. So look, mutations themselves aren't particularly the issue. The issue is, look, in the 60s when they had this conference with the biologists, and looking at some of the probabilities that we were actually even talking about, the mathematicians pointed out the biologists and saying your models of neo-Darwinism, you've got to think of a different model because your model as proposed just mathematically just doesn't work. To which the biologists still haven't particularly found a different model. It's not that the problems have gone away. Here's another way of explaining it, and this is...
We're just not prepared to accept...
Well, I use this illustration in one of my presentations. Let's say that you have a black box. Okay, we'll just use this for an example here. Okay, let's say we assume this is a black box. And let's say that the black box is the bounds which you look for the answer to a question. And look, let's say that, look, if the answer is there and you ask a question, look, if you look long enough and hard enough, well, theoretically you should find the answer. Let's say, well, okay, let's put it this way, actually, the right way. Let's say that the answer is in the apple. Now, here's the next thing. Let's say that we draw a line here across there. And let's say that we can ask a question, but we can look everywhere in that box, but we can't go in that section. Are we going to find the answer if indeed apple is the answer? We're not. But what if the question is about the origin of the universe or the origin of life? And let's say the real answer is God. But let's say that you put a line there and say you can look everywhere else, but you can't go there. Now, look, you're not going to really find a satisfactory answer, ultimately, that's going to work. And I think that's a difficulty. You know, there's a Harvard professor, they made the statement, whether they're still a professor or not, I don't know, maybe it was some years ago, but Professor Lewontin, a biologist, I think from memory. Very interesting quote. They've paraphrased it. They said, look, it's not the mechanisms of science, or science itself demands that we come up with natural or materialistic answers to things. No, science itself doesn't demand that we find only natural causes. But that's the way we go about doing science, because that is our philosophical presupposition. And we will not allow a divine foot in the door. In fact, they've actually said that. In an interesting quote, and as I say, I'm paraphrasing it, but I do cite that at times. So they're basically saying it's not that science demands that everything be materialistic and physical only, but it's just that because of the presuppositions of science, of the scientific materialist, I should say, that you can't look for God as being part of the answer, and that's part of the problem. And this is the reverse question. If God did bring the universe into being, how could the materialists know? What evidence would it take to convince them? And the question is, if you've already made up your mind by saying that we're only looking in this section, then the evidence ultimately is not going to convince if you've already said that it can't happen.
Some of the scientists that I listen to, they believe in design, they don't believe in God.
Yep.
So they say they're an atheist, they're not going to believe in God. But the idea of design, and then when you ask, or going further, who did the design, whatever you want to believe in,
Okay.
is there they're doing. And so they were designed or everything was designed by something. But they don't really need to go further of what the design was.
Does that mean they're open to different ideas or of who or what the designer was?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, interesting.
So take little bits from.
Okay, which is interesting because science itself, I think, can identify that there's design.
Yeah.
But then it's an entirely different question. What can we know about the designer? And that's where, and look, I guess some of the things we've spoken about are naturalistic. This is as the Scripture tells us. God has been revealed through nature. Paul talks about this in Romans. And interesting, Anthony Flew was able to, look at DNA and conclude that there is a God. But this is the next point, and this is where, looking at apologetics, there's what we call classical apologetics, which look at the proof of the existence of God. But then there's the next step: how do we get to believing in the Christian God, and how do we know the source of the designer? And that's the identity of the designer, and that's also a very good question. Actually, I'm just looking. Oh yeah, we probably need to start wrapping up soon, but I'm happy to keep going as long as you guys want.
Is there anyone else we should look out, listen to, apart from John Marks?
Oh, sorry,
Any other?
on science and religion?
Yeah.
Look, I've got to say, one of the guys who I rate very highly, he has written some stuff, is John Ashton. Anyone here know John Ashton? I mean, Adventist guy I'm not sure if it's still his role, but he was the head of research at Sanitarium Health Foods, the Sanitarium, based in Coorabong. Look, I've met him many times, a lovely guy. And he's written a book, probably a couple of years ago now, called Evolution Impossible. And he deals with a lot of, looks at the different angles of stuff there. And here, look, I know I've concentrated on just the biology and design. There's many other issues that we could talk about if you wanted to. But look, he's a guy. John Lennox wrote a book called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? I think it's gone through 2 or 3 editions. Exceptionally good, and as I say, he's the guy who debated Dawkins, and I think came out far on top. They're two that spring immediately to mind. It depends which particular issues within science and religion are of interest too. Look, there's a lot of material out there. I should have mentioned, well, I probably should, to comment, there are different perspectives as well. Probably what has been the traditional view of the Christian church through the last many thousand, or 2,000 years plus, is that God created and fairly recently. Of course, atheistic evolution says that it happened over millions and billions of years by natural process. There are also various other positions that some Christians have adopted. Some may have heard of theistic evolution, where it's put forward that evolution as described by the biology textbooks, macroevolution is the way that God God directed the process. Look, I'm not particularly comfortable with that. I think it has many issues of what we call systematic theology with the rest of Scripture, and I think puts forward a God that is different, I think, than what is revealed in Scripture. Similarly, there are others who talk about progressive creation, where a little bit along the lines of Stephen Jay Gould, you may have heard of punctuated equilibrium, a view in the 1970s, where because the fossil record actually wasn't supportive of evolution, there were just when the transitionary fossils and the gaps were huge, Stephen Jay Gould put forward the idea that there was long periods where nothing happened in evolution history, and then there were big bursts of frenetic activity where a lot of things change, and then for millions of years nothing happened, and then other bursts. Along similar lines, there are people who Hugh Ross is probably a classical example. You may have seen some of his books in Christian bookstores. He argues for essentially a Christian view of progressive creation, or he says where God intervened at various steps in evolution history. Again, look, I guess these are attempts to harmonise different views, but ultimately, look, I don't consider that they're successful, because it actually then will contradict various other, very clear passages in Scripture itself. Anyway, a lot could be said about that, but I won't. So, look, as I said, we could talk about science and religion for a long time, but I guess my summary is on that. I haven't even got to the third speaker in the debate. By the way, that was a moral argument. We don't have time for that tonight. But you know, the whole science and religion aspect and the origin of the universe, I think even as we've looked at it there, I think looking at the evidence, you know, I think it's reasonable to say that macroevolution and the idea that things came from nothing is extraordinarily difficult to accept unless on some pretty significant faith. And I'd be arguing that the idea of a creator God who brought the universe into being and who designed the living world is a much more plausible explanation. I'm just mindful of time. I'm just wondering, look, we've only covered some of the things of the 40 on the list, but tomorrow, what I'm happy to do is spend a bit more time on some of these, you know, key issues, but I want to at least make some comment. I'll try to, either myself or, you know, as a group, we'll try to comment on as many of them as we possibly can. Ideally every one of them, even if it's only a few sentences on each one.
Beautiful. Thanks heaps, Dr. Phillip. And yeah, definitely had my brain working there, which is good because it doesn't get worked very often. So they say. Yeah, YouTube's a killer. But yeah, thank you very much. I hope that was thought-provoking. Hopefully that raised more questions for you guys as well. If it did, write them down. Now tomorrow morning at 10 we have another session here, and tomorrow afternoon at 4. But if, like today, we say we run out of time, we want to include more sessions tomorrow, if that's possible. That's depending on your agenda.
I'm at your service this weekend,
Yeah.
so look, if people are interested in talking about stuff,
Yeah.
happy to talk about it.
Yeah. So, and if you think there's a specific topic that needs, like, can we just spend an hour just discussing this topic as a group? Then, like, we can just, you know, tomorrow's very flexible. It all depends on everyone's availability, but yeah, definitely tomorrow at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. in here. So yeah, thank you. And like Phil said, we'll do all we can. They're all huge questions, valid questions. But yeah.
We'll do our best to try to cover. I reckon we'll have a shot at every one of them, even if some of them might be 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And that's all.
And yeah, if some of you can't make it tomorrow, I know there's the African Festival on and other school.
Yeah.
Oh, are you going there?
You referred to us.
No, I was referring to Ben.
Yeah, we're doing fundraising.
But if anyone's not going to be here tomorrow, give me your email and I'll send a voice recording out to you.
I've got a question. Are those two sections be talking about same topic or we have different topics?
Different things.
Oh.
We won't,
no.
it'll all be different.
This
I
one
mean,
repeated.
can that two sections tomorrow or will be same?
Oh no, it'll be completely different. So
Oh.
tomorrow what we'll do is head more into, you know, those 40 different topics. I know we've covered maybe a few of them tonight, but what I want to do is to go into a broader detail, you know, a lot of different topics. Today was mainly, look, I guess in the end it was mainly science, but some people might not even be interested in science, so look, don't worry, it's not all going to be science. You know, we'll deal with history, we'll deal with philosophy, we'll deal with you know, some of the aspects out of psychology or religion, or you know, we'll deal with a lot of different issues as we've you know, brainstormed there that impact on reasons why it is credible to believe, and deal with what are some of the objections to belief, and how can we deal with those objections, and you know, are there good answers? You know, and they're the type of things we'll be talking about. But no, every session is going